of SSK team, and today I'm very pleased to have Martin Hart-Landsberg and talk with him. Even though all of you know him very well, but let me introduce briefly about his career. He is professor of economics and director of the political economy program at Lewis and Clark College, Portland, Oregon. And he already published a very excellent book about Korean experience of militant unionism in the early 1990s. The title is Rush to Development. And recently, maybe 2017, he co-worked and published a book on Korea with Seung-Wook, and he published many other excellent books. For example, the title is Capitalist Globalization, Consequences, Resistance, and Alternatives, and other works. And also he published very interesting many works, co-worked with Paul Baek. And I like his work, and I got lots of insights from his analysis. So I'm pleased to talk with him. And today his title is very interesting. What the US New Deal experience teaches us winning a great New Deal. Yeah, so very interesting title. So please give us your presentation about 40 minutes. After that, start our discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm really honored to be part of this speaker series that has so many thoughtful and committed people. Because of time differences, I don't get to watch many of them live, but I always go online to watch them and have learned a lot. And I hope my presentation will prove useful to other people as well. So as was said, the title of my talk is What the New Deal Can Teach Us About Winning a Green New Deal. At least in the United States, and I think other places as well, there's a lot of interest in a Green New Deal. And in the United States, there are a lot of activists who support a Green New Deal transformation of the economy, seeing that as the best way to tackle the escalating global climate crisis and the country's economic and social problems. At present, the Green New Deal is a kind of a big tent idea. In broad brush, it includes calls for massive new investments to promote the production and distribution of renewable energy, expand energy efficient public transit systems, support regenerative agriculture, retrofit homes and offices, as well as including the funding of high quality universal healthcare, childcare, safe public housing, healthy food, and the list goes on. That said, there are a lot of differences between Green New Deal activists. We heard a little bit of some of that during Patrick Bond's talk. Some of the major differences are over the speed of transformation, the role of public ownership, the use of nuclear power, but perhaps even more central in terms of some of the debates are the differences between those who think that you can have sustained and sustainable growth and those who believe that that's impossible, people who argue for degrowth or what they call the Green New Deal without growth. These are important debates, and I'm not going to address any of them. What I'm interested in is the issue of how does one actually build a movement capable of winning a Green New Deal? And because some of these debates have been so intense, I think people have focused on them more than on the question of what does it take to kind of build the movement to make these ideas really have some political significance. And I think the lack of attention to organizing is especially problematic given the Green New Deal's identification with the original 1930s New Deal. The 1930s New Deal remains very popular with a lot of working people, with most accepting the conventional wisdom that we have President Roosevelt and his willingness to take strong, innovative actions to thank for it. And this understanding has encouraged a lot of activists to focus on electing a progressive president and devising the programs that the new president should implement. Unfortunately, this understanding of the evolution of the New Deal is seriously flawed. In order to challenge this conventional wisdom, and even more importantly, highlight the need for critical thinking about organizing, I decided to examine the strategy and tactics of organizers during the 30s in order to try and draw out the lessons for current activists. The structure of my presentation is going to follow my paper, which I think will be made available somewhere on the website, or I can send it to people who would like it. And what I did is divide the paper, and I'm going to divide my presentation into 5 sections. And each of these is sort of chronological. The first section deals with the early years of the Great Depression and the unwillingness of elites to support any meaningful federal program of economic restructuring. The second section examines the rise of the unemployed movement and its role in pushing Roosevelt to initiate new employment and relief programs as part of the 1933 First New Deal. The third section evaluates those New Deal programs and highlights the ways in which they failed to measure up to what working people demanded and needed. The fourth section looks at the continuing growth of popular movements of the unemployed, those on relief, and union activists, and their role in forcing Roosevelt to initiate his signature 1935 Second New Deal policies. And the fifth and final section critically evaluates those second New Deal policies, highlighting their shortcomings, and also takes up the issue of why movements were unable to force a more transformative third New Deal. This is kind of a challenging paper to present because the history is complicated and also in some ways assumes some knowledge of the US experience, but I'll do my very best to highlight and explain the most important events. And of course, my paper provides more detail. So let me start with the first section, the early years of the Great Depression. The US economy expanded rapidly through the 1920s. It's a period called the Roaring Twenties in the United States, but it was also a period marked by economic instability. The economy suffered a major downturn in 1920-21, then mild recessions in 1924 and 27, and there are growing signs of the start of another recession in summer 1929, months before the October 1929 stock market collapse and the start of the Great Depression. The first years of the Depression were horrendous. Manufacturing output fell by about 40% between 1929 and 33. 5,000 banks failed over the same period. This hit workers really hard. Between 1930 and 32, the number of unemployed grew from 3 million to 15 million. The unemployment rate for those who did not work in agriculture was close to 37%. There were homeless armies wandering the country. Strikingly, despite the severity of the economic and social crisis, business and government leaders were in no hurry to act. In fact, business leaders initially downplayed the seriousness of the crisis and were generally optimistic about a quick recovery. President Hoover repeatedly claimed that the economy was on a sound and prosperous basis. The solution to the crisis, he believed, was to be found in restoring business confidence, and that was best achieved by maintaining a balanced budget. When it came to relief for the unemployed, Hoover believed that the federal government's role was to encourage local government and private efforts, not to initiate programs of its own. At the time of the stock market crash, relief for the poor was primarily provided by private charities, which relied on donations. Only 8 states had any type of unemployment insurance. Not surprisingly, this was a totally inadequate system. For example, in 1933, only 1/4 of all the unemployed received any kind of assistance. It was not till the end of 1932, 3 years into the crisis, that some business leaders began to consider the desirability of a federal recovery program, but only for business. Most of their suggestions were modeled on World War I programs and involved government-business partnerships designed to regulate and stabilize markets. By the time of Roosevelt's inauguration in March 1933, the economy was clearly in crisis. Roosevelt had won the presidency promising a New Deal for the American people, but his first initiatives were very much in line with the policies of the previous administration. For example, 6 days after his inauguration, he called for cutting the federal budget by some 15%. So in this period, the lessons are pretty simple, which is that even a sharp economic and social crisis can't be counted on to encourage elites to explore policies that might change the existing structures of power. And the takeaway for current Green New Deal activists is that we shouldn't expect that simply establishing the seriousness of our current environmental crisis will be enough to encourage elites to consider a transformative Green New Deal, especially since, in contrast to the Depression era, the largest corporations continue to enjoy rising profits. That's a pretty simple lesson to draw. So let me go to the next period, the rise of the unemployed movement and its role in pushing Roosevelt to launch his first New Deal. It wasn't until May 1933 that Roosevelt finally introduced job creation and relief programs as part of his first New Deal. And perhaps, or at least what I would argue, the main reason he did this was because of the militancy of the movement of the unemployed. The rise of the unemployed movement owes much to the organizing work of the Communist Party. While there's a lot to criticize about the Communist Party, particularly its aggressive antagonisms towards other political tendencies, there's also a lot we can learn from its work with the unemployed in the early years of the Depression. The Communist Party made a decision to organize the unemployed 2 months before the stock market crash, when it began creating a nationwide organization of unemployed councils. The Communist Party's first big effort directed towards the unemployed was the March 6, 1930 demonstration against unemployment and for relief that drew some 500,000 people in 25 cities and was organized under the banner of International Day for Struggle Against Worldwide Unemployment. New York City had the largest demonstration, and it was met, like many of those were, with police repression. A lot of demonstrators were beaten and arrested. But another protest that took place only in New York about 5 months later, in October, produced a victory, with the city agreeing to boost relief spending by $1 million. These demonstrations, and particularly the success, created visibility for the unemployed councils and helped to build their membership. The Unemployed Councils of the USA was formed in early July 1933, drawing together all the separate unemployed councils. The following month, it issued a statement calling on Congress to adopt its Workers' Unemployment Insurance Bill. The bill called for unemployment payments tied to local wages, with additional payments for each dependent of the unemployed person. The payments were to be financed by new taxes on corporations and the wealthy. Initially, the Communist Party dominated the unemployed councils. It imposed its own general program. But in November, acknowledging that this was limiting recruitment, the party agreed to give organizers the freedom to drop slogans dealing with the Soviet Union and foreign policy questions and concentrate on issues of most concern to the unemployed. In the months that followed, there was a wave of rent strikes, eviction fights, and hunger marches involving an estimated 300,000 workers in 75 cities and 6 states that swept the country. The unemployed councils had become a force to reckon with. So how were they organized? What did they do? Most unemployed councils were neighborhood-centered, since the unemployed generally spent most of their time in the neighborhoods where they lived. The basic unit of the Unemployed Council was the Block Committee, which comprised all the unemployed local residents and all their family members. Each Block Committee would elect a delegate to a neighborhood unemployed council, and then those councils elected delegates to county or city unemployed councils, and then to state councils. The Block Committee served as a social center where the unemployed could gather and build relationships. Through conversations and even more importantly, actions, they were able to develop a radical understanding of the causes of their unemployment, as well as an appreciation for collective power. As Steve Nelson, who is a leader of the Chicago Unemployed Council movement explained, he said it was important for the unemployed to see that unemployment was not the result of their own or someone else's mistake, that it was a worldwide phenomenon and a natural product of the system. And he went on to say, unemployed agitation was as much education as direct action. With time on their hands, a lot of the unemployed were eager to act in defense of their neighbors, especially around housing. Here is Christine Ellis, who was an unemployed council organizer in Illinois, talking about what happened at one meeting in a Black neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. And I'm going to quote her. We spoke simply, explained the platform, the demands and activities of the Unemployed Council. And then we said, are there any questions? Finally, an elderly Black man stood up and said, what do you folks figure on doing about the colored family that was thrown out of their house today? They're still out there and their furniture is on the sidewalk. So the man with me said, very simple. We'll adjourn the meeting, go over there and put the furniture back in the house. After that, anyone wishing to join the Unemployed Council and build an organization to fight evictions, return to this hall and we'll talk about it some more. That's what we did. Everybody pitched in, began to haul in every last bit of furniture, fix up the beds. And when that was all done, we went back to the hall and the hall was jammed. According to one account, unemployed councils had practically stopped evictions in Detroit by March 1931. It was estimated that in 1932, 77,000 New York families were moved back into their homes by unemployed councils. The councils also mobilized to help people who were turned down for relief, organizing delegations that held sit-ins at relief agencies until the agencies agreed to give relief. With demands for relief escalating, cash-strapped relief agencies began pressing city governments for more money, but city government budgets were shrinking because of the Depression. It was an explosive situation. In 1932, with Chicago's unemployment rate at 40%, the city's mayor told the Congress to send $150 million today or federal troops in the future. It's worth emphasizing then that the militancy of the unemployed movement was now pushing mayors and even some business leaders to also press for federal action. And of course, that process and that development served to amplify the Unemployed Council's own national campaigns demanding a program of federal relief and job creation. These national campaigns, by design, also helped generate publicity and support for local unemployed council actions. For example, in early 1931, the Communist Party created a new organization, the Unemployed Committee for the National Hunger March, to coordinate a national hunger march on Washington, D.C. to demand federal unemployment insurance and emergency winter relief for the unemployed. Local conferences selected some 2,000 people to carry the message to Washington. Their trip across the country was supported financially and materially by local unemployed councils. To no one's surprise, the delegates were denied entrance to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. to present their demands. They stayed 2 days and then they went back. But they didn't just go back. They went back stopping throughout the United States in among five different groups, visiting each unemployed council to talk about the national program, to talk about the demand, and to talk about what needed to happen to get change. So this was an example of a very close interplay between national and local organizing, with the one reinforcing the other. They organized another national hunger march the following year. It's worth noting that underpinning the strategic orientation of the work of the unemployed councils was the Communist Party's determination to build anti-racist unity. For example, the Communist Party made sure that all of its agitation in the unemployed councils included protests against racial discrimination by relief agencies, landlords, and local and federal governments. There was also other organizing going on. There was actually some other organizing related to unemployed people. The Socialist Party and the A.J. Muste-led Conference of Progressive Labor Action also had organizations concerned with the unemployed, but they were few in number and initially not committed to the direct action practiced by the Unemployed Councils. The Socialist Party organizations were primarily made up of middle-class people who did education around unemployment, and the Muste organizations were largely focused on self-help activities, creating their own production to sell to raise funds to support them. But farmers were quite militant, organizing to protest evictions. There was farm organizations like the Farm Holiday Association, which not only mobilized their members to resist evictions, it also actively supported a progressive income tax, federal relief for the urban unemployed, and federal government control of the banks. In short, the country's political trajectory was one that concerned a growing number of political and business leaders. The growth and activities of the unemployed and farmer movements revealed a growing radical arc as more people openly challenged the legitimacy of the police, the courts, and other state institutions. Recognizing the need for action to preserve existing structures of power, it took Roosevelt only 3 months to drop his commitment to economic orthodoxy in favor of New Deal experimentation. So what are the lessons that we should learn from this period? Well, the first obvious one is that it took mass pressure to get Roosevelt to reverse course and launch his first New Deal. And there can be no question that much like then, we're going to need to build a powerful mass movement to push the state to advance a Green New Deal bill. But there are more specific lessons that can be learned from the period about movement building itself, starting with the Communist Party's strategic choices in targeting the unemployed and building a national movement of the unemployed, anchored by a network of unemployed councils. The unemployed councils helped transform how people understood the cause of their hard times. They also created a local, collective, and direct outlet for action in defense of immediate shared basic needs. The Communist Party also emphasized the importance of organizing those actions in ways designed to overcome important divisions among working people. At the same time, the party and the unemployed councils created national campaigns for new public policies that were directly responsive to local concerns and actions. In this way, local organizing gave weight to national demands, and the pursuit of those demands through national campaigns helped to build awareness of local efforts and support local organizing. The result was a process that built political awareness, leadership capacity, class unity, and national support for public initiatives. The call for a Green New Deal speaks to a variety of crises and the need for change in many different sectors, including, for example, food production, energy generation, transportation, housing, healthcare. Drawing on the experiences of the 1930s highlights the need to think carefully about how to ensure that our organizing around each issue both illuminates the ways in which capitalist accumulation blocks meaningful solutions and also helps to overcome existing racial, ethnic, and gender divisions. It also challenges us to think about how to ensure that our efforts in different geographic areas and around different issues will connect to build a national presence that creates and unites our various efforts and also projects a vision of the new society we want to create. So let me go on to the third period, the first New Deal and its limitations. As I mentioned, in response to the new political realities, Roosevelt soon launched a dizzying array of initiatives, most of which were adopted in his first 100 days of office. These comprise what is known as the First New Deal. The majority of these First New Deal programs were aimed at stabilizing markets, which Roosevelt believed, as did Hoover before him, was the best way to restore business confidence, investment, and growth. These included programs to stabilize agriculture, the stock market, the housing market, and the banking industry. In fact, John Maynard Keynes wrote Roosevelt a public letter in December of 1933, pointing out that the Roosevelt administration appeared more concerned with reform than with recovery. Primary attention, he argued, should be on recovery, and that required greater government spending financed by borrowing to boost national purchasing power. Now, the first New Deal did include several job creation and relief initiatives, but they were deliberately designed in ways that limited their ability to meaningfully address worker demands for jobs and a humane relief system. And let me talk about what those programs were and their limitations. The four most important were the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Public Works Administration, and the Civil Works Administration. I'm only going to talk about two, just given time, and there's more discussion in my paper. But I'm going to talk about the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which was the first program of direct federal financing of relief, and the Civil Works Administration, which was the best of the four programs. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration offered grants to states that allowed state and local governments to employ people who were already on relief rolls to work on a variety of public projects. The grants supported the employment of over 20 million people, about 16% of the total population of the United States. However, the program had a lot of shortcomings. The program provided funds to the states on a matching basis. States were required to contribute $3 for every federal dollar. And because a lot of states were struggling with budget shortfalls, the amount of money that they could take was always very limited. More important and more problematic was the program required that participants be on state relief rolls. This meant that only one person in a family, usually the male head of household, was eligible to participate, and the amount of pay or relief was determined by a social worker's evaluation of the family's financial need. And many of the states had very low standards of necessity, which resulted in the workers on these programs getting very little money for the work they did. In many cases, actually, what was given to the workers were coupons that were exchangeable only for food items on an approved list. Pressed to do more, the Roosevelt administration launched the Civil Works Administration in November of 1933. This was a dramatically different program. Employment was not limited to those on relief, which greatly increased the number of unemployed who could participate. And it also meant that participants were not subject to any humiliating means test or to have their wages tied to an estimated minimal family budget. Also, there's the fact that the CWA, the Civil Works Administration, the administrators, made a real effort to employ workers in projects of value to the community. Workers flocked to the program, and that was the problem. Officials had planned for 4 million people, but some 15 million workers applied for jobs. And as the enormity of the demand for work became clear, Roosevelt ended the program out of concern it would be too costly. The CWA lasted only 6 months, with most employment creation ending after 4 months. So what lessons should we take from this period? I think the most important to be drawn from this period is that major policy transformations do not come easily or fully developed. It was political pressure that forced Roosevelt into pursuing the first New Deal. And though he did break new ground in acknowledging federal responsibility for relief and job creation, he proved reluctant to embrace the transformative role that many now attribute to him. This means that current organizing work must build popular awareness that movements are not likely to win full implementation of their demands for a Green New Deal at one moment in time. Rather, political leaders will most likely respond to demands for transformative change with reforms designed to blunt or contain more radical possibilities. A related lesson is that the process of system transformation is not likely to be advanced by advocating for modest demands in the belief that these can be easily won and that successive governments will be predisposed to deepen them over time. This means that our movements must put forward the most progressive demands that can win popular support at the time, while preparing movement participants for a long and complex struggle. So let me turn now to the fourth period, the role of popular movements in forcing a second New Deal. The first New Deal, for obvious reasons of these limitations I just mentioned, did little to slow mass organizing. Although the economy was beginning to recover, at least 10 million workers remained without jobs, and almost 20 million people remained at least partially dependent on relief. Thus, the movement of the unemployed continued to grow and broaden. Beginning in 1933, both the Socialist Party and the Conference of Progressive Labor Action changed their approach to unemployment organizing, with their respective organizations increasingly operating much like the Communist Party's Unemployed Councils. The Conference of Progressive Labor Action began their turn to militant organizing in early 1933. In July, their group, which was called the Unemployed Citizens League, changed their names to, they created a new national organization called the National Unemployed League, and they changed their name from the Unemployed Citizens League to the Unemployed League. And the Unemployed Leagues began much like the Unemployed Councils, staging mass sit-ins at relief offices to overturn negative decisions. One sit-in, for example, in Pittsburgh, they were very strong in the Midwest, and one sit-in in Pittsburgh lasted for 59 days. They also organized mass resistance to court-ordered evictions, blocking sheriffs when possible, or returning furniture to evictees' homes if it had been removed. Several unemployed leagues in several cities also engaged in direct appropriation of food from government warehouses in line with their slogan, "Give us relief or we'll take it." Not only did unemployed organizing continue after the passage of the first New Deal programs, the movement slowly began to unify as unemployed activists from the three different political tendencies increasingly began working together and supporting each other's efforts. There was also new organizing that was taking place. And here this had to do with the workers on relief. For example, in 1934, the Communist Party began organizing those receiving Federal Emergency Relief Administration funds for work, as well as those employed by the CWA. The Communist Party-sponsored Relief Workers League organized grievance committees to fight discrimination, especially against African-American and foreign-born workers, fought for higher pay with cost of living adjustments, free transportation to work sites, free medical care, and a moratorium on electric and gas charges for those on relief. And perhaps most importantly in this period, there was trade union organizing. 1934 saw an explosion. Well, let me say that this was because the recovering economy, more and more people were getting employed. And so a lot of the left activists began to shift from the unemployed organizing to union organizing. And 1934 saw an explosion of trade union organizing, including three major successful union struggles, which included one general strike. The first major struggle was in Toledo, Ohio, which at the time was a major center for automobile parts manufacturing. Thousands of workers, with the support of the local unemployed leagues, set up a mass picket around one of the largest manufacturers to force it to recognize the union, even though the courts had issued an injunction making the picket illegal. In an effort to break the blockade, the sheriff and deputies used tear gas, water hoses, and guns. The workers responded by stoning the plant and burning all the cars that were in the company parking lot. Unable to break the strike, the company was forced to close the plant. After 2 weeks of federal mediation, the company and the union reached an agreement. The company recognized the union and hiked average wages by 5%. At almost the same time, another major union struggle started in Minneapolis, this one led by a Trotskyist-led Teamster local. To force transportation companies to bargain with the union, the local basically organized a shutdown of all commercial transportation in the city, allowing only approved farmers to deliver food directly to grocers. Violent attempts to break the strike were rebuffed, with many injured and 2 strikers killed. Other unions responding to this violence, especially in the building trades, began striking in solidarity with the Teamsters, with many labor activists talking about a full general strike vote. After several weeks, again, the federal government intervened, applied pressure, and the employers finally settled, signing a contract with the local. A general strike did take place in San Francisco, almost shortly after the Minneapolis struggle. This one was led by left activists affiliated more with the Communist Party. Locals of the International Longshoremen's Association had been organizing for a coast-wide strike to win a shorter work week, higher pay, union recognition, and a union-run hiring hall. San Francisco longshoremen struck on May 9th and were quickly joined by dock workers in every other West Coast port, as well as many sailors and waterfront truckers. All told, about 40,000 maritime workers stopped working. The employers and the police tried to break the picket line that had halted the loading and unloading of goods on the waterfront, leading to a full-scale battle between the police and strikers in San Francisco. 2 strikers were shot and killed on what became known as Bloody Thursday. The following day, San Francisco longshoremen called for a general strike. Some 150,000 workers went out, eventually bringing economic activity in San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, and other nearby municipalities to a halt. After 3 days, the city union leadership called off the strike and agreed to federal arbitration. In October, the arbitrator gave the workers most of what they demanded. These struggles showed a growth in worker militancy and radicalism that sent shockwaves through the corporate community as well as the government. They were, in the words of the labor historian Stephen Fraser, a barometer of just how far down the road of anti-capitalism the working class movement had traveled. All of this meant for Roosevelt mounting pressure to do something. And thus by 1935, it was very clear to him that he needed to act, and to act decisively to reestablish his authority and control over events. And I guess his political abilities are well illustrated by the fact that the 3 signature achievements of the Second New Deal, the Works Progress Administration, which dealt with unemployed, the Social Security Act, and the National Labor Relations Act, not only responded to the demands of the mass movements, but did so in a way that successfully allowed him to take back the initiative from the left. So what lessons can we learn from this period? And then I'll go to the very last period with the Second New Deal. I think this period had a lot of important lessons for those advocating a Green New Deal. One is that movement building is a dynamic process, changing in response to political and economic developments. It was the movement of unemployed that spearheaded the political pressures leading to the First New Deal. First New Deal policies and the economic recovery then changed the organizing terrain, leading to new organizing and new movements of workers on relief and in trade unions. At the same time, there were strong threads tying these movements together. One of the most important was that participation in one movement, for example, the unemployed movement, provided an educational experience that helped create organizers able to spur the work of the newer movements, for example, the labor movements. There were a lot of organizers from the Unemployed Councils who, as they got work, became leading organizers of trade unions because they knew how to organize. And because all of these movements owed much to the work of left political groups, there was a common vision that encouraged each to support the struggles of the other, as well as join in support of even bigger demands, such as for a new system of social insurance. I should say, whenever there were strikes, the Unemployed Councils set up picket lines to make sure that no one would cross them, to strengthen the hand of those with jobs who were fighting for unions. Advocates of a Green New Deal need to pay careful attention to this organizing experience. Given the Green New Deal's multidimensional concerns, achieving it will likely require organizing in many different arenas, which will likely require, at least in an early stage, organizing a number of different movements each with its own speed of development and potentially separate concerns. The challenge will be finding ways to ensure coordination, productive interactions, and an emerging unified vision around big transformative demands. So let me now turn to my last section, the last time period, the second New Deal, its shortcomings, and the inability of activists to force a third New Deal. When people talk about the innovative and transformative policies of the New Deal, they normally mean the programs I mentioned: the Works Progress Administration, the Social Security Act, and the National Labor Relations Act. However, as we'll see now, each of these signature initiatives again fell short of what progressive movements were demanding. Unfortunately, changing political and economic conditions greatly weakened the left over the following years, leaving it unable to sustain its organizing and pressure on the state. As a consequence, there was no third New Deal. So let me look at these three signature policies. The Works Progress Administration was Roosevelt's response to popular demands for employment. Created in May 1935, it employed some 9 million people to work on public projects, primarily on the construction of public buildings and roads. Federal Project Number 1, a much smaller program that operated under the Works Progress Administration umbrella, employed musicians, artists, writers, actors, and directors in a variety of literacy, media, drama, and arts programs. Unfortunately, despite a lot of many celebrated projects, the program fell short. Participation in Works Progress Administration projects required a state means test. Thus, unemployment alone was not enough to qualify a person for the program. This also meant that participants remained subject to demeaning monitoring of their spending habits and living conditions. Also, little effort was made to match worker skills to jobs. People without higher education went into construction. People with higher education were put into office work, and there was no attempt to really fine-tune that. The program did pay market wages, but limits were put on maximum allowable hours of weekly employment, in addition to the overall limit on total earnings, which was tied to the means tests. In contrast, the unemployed movement wanted a permanent federal employment program that would pay union wages and guarantee full employment. And they wanted that program to employ people to produce needed goods and services in a direct counter to private production. But this was far from the vision of the Roosevelt administration. Here's what Harry Hopkins, chief administrator of the Works Progress Administration, explained. Policy from the first was not to compete with private business. Hence, we could neither work on private property, set up a rival merchandising system, nor form a work outlet through manufacturing, even though manufacturing had contributed to relief roles hundreds of thousands of workers accustomed to operating machines and to doing nothing else for a living. This was the reason why the WPA focused on construction of public buildings and roads. It couldn't do anything that would compete with private enterprise. Let me talk about the Social Security Act. Social Security Act is considered the New Deal's crown jewel. It was a very complex piece of legislation that included not only what is known today in the US as Social Security, which is a federal old age benefit program, but it also included a program of unemployment insurance administered by states. Roosevelt's commitment to Social Security was largely a response to the growing popularity of the Communist Party's own initiative. The Communist Party began pushing its workers' unemployment insurance bill in the summer of 1930, as I mentioned earlier. And it, as well as the Unemployed Councils, worked hard to promote it over the following years. Finally, in February 1934, Representative Ernest London of the Farmer Labor Party introduced the CP-authored Workers' Unemployment and Social Insurance Bill in the House of Representatives. In broad brush, this bill mandated the immediate payment of unemployment insurance to all unemployed workers and farmers of an amount equal to the average local full-time wages and additional stipends, family stipends for each dependent. Those forced into part-time employment were to receive the difference between their earnings and the average local full-time wage. And all benefits were to be financed on taxes on inheritance and high-income individuals and corporations. Not surprisingly, the bill enjoyed strong support among workers and was endorsed by 5 international unions, 35 central labor bodies, and more than 3,000 local unions. And when Congress refused to act on the bill, London reintroduced it in January 1935. It became the first social insurance plan to be recommended by a congressional committee. Not surprisingly, it was voted down by the full House of Representatives. Roosevelt strongly opposed the London bill, and it was to provide a counter that he pushed for an alternative. Roosevelt got his wish. His bill, known as the Social Security Act, was signed into law on August 14, 1935. Rather than a progressively funded, comprehensive, and here I'm focusing on the unemployed part now, not the old age part, rather than a progressively funded, comprehensive national system of unemployment insurance, the act established an unemployment insurance system that was dependent on state financing and which gave states wide latitude in determining standards. States could decide eligibility conditions, the waiting period to receive benefits, benefit amounts, minimum and maximum benefit levels, duration of benefits, disqualifications, and other administrative matters. It was not until 1938 that most states began paying benefits. 10 of them required employee contributions as well as employer contributions. 3 still do today. And as a consequence, there's a wide range of unemployment benefits and conditions throughout each state in the United States. It's a very cumbersome and complex system. It has improved over the years. It's broadened the coverage and it boosts the benefits, but the basic structure has not changed. It's overly complicated. There's a patchwork of state eligibility requirements and miserly benefits. And workers today in the United States are paying the cost. Only 1/3 of the unemployed in the United States today are currently receiving benefits. Because if you're unemployed too long, you go through them. If you don't make enough money, you're not eligible. If you have no work history, you're not eligible. If, all sorts of reasons keep people from being on the unemployed to collect unemployed. And the amount, the average amount is equal to 40% of wages. In some states, it's even lower. The Social Security retirement part of the act is similarly limited. Rather than a progressively financed system, workers are themselves forced to contribute half of the benefits, half of the funds, and there are no limits on how much high-income workers, and there are limits on how much high-income workers need to contribute. Above about 130,000, their income is no longer taxed by Social Security. Moreover, the size of the retirement benefit is dependent on years of work and total earnings. Thus, low-wage workers often find themselves living in poverty even while collecting Social Security. Far different from what the Communist Party's bill would have guaranteed for people. Now, the last one, the National Labor Relations Act. And here I'm going to be kind of brief because it's a very complicated act, but it's still important. In the spring of 1934, Senator Robert Wagner introduced a bill to establish a new labor relations board. Few in Congress supported the bill. President Roosevelt also opposed it. Wagner reintroduced a revised version of his bill a year later, and suddenly everyone was for it. In May 1935, it received unanimous support in the Senate Labor Committee, followed by strong support in both the Senate and House and from President Roosevelt. The reason is clear. The growing militancy of workers in Toledo, Minneapolis, and San Francisco, who showed a willingness to confront the courts and police as well as their employers, scared the politicians and the corporations. It was to head off further radicalization of the labor movement that Congress and Roosevelt, who initially opposed the act, now were for it. because they liked the way it had mechanisms which regularized the unionization process. And their strategy was successful. The National Labor Relations Act legitimated collective bargaining, and in doing so, set limits to the issues that could be bargained over, imposed responsibilities on unions as well as managers, and by design, forced disputes into a legal framework that privileged lawyers over rank and file militancy. For a few years, it appeared that worker militancy would continue despite the National Labor Relations Board existence. The number of strikes grew dramatically from 2,000 in 1935 to almost 5,000 in 1937, with workers increasingly winning unionization through direct action, but this upward trajectory of militant class-conscious activity would not be sustained. So now let me just briefly talk about the movement's decline and a few lessons, and then I welcome your comments and thoughts. Tragically, even as the movement's different political tendencies began to unify, leading, for example, to the creation of a unified national organization of the unemployed in 1936, the movement began to suffer a loss of militancy and vision that left it unable to further influence political developments. One reason was the ability of these second New Deal reforms to co-opt and demobilize activists. For example, as the relief system became professionalized, activists found that many relief recipients no longer supported mass actions. Moreover, a number of relief offices actually offered jobs to local unemployed activists with the promise that they could make the system work more efficiently operating within it, and those jobs were accepted. The newly formed National Organization of the Unemployed, called the Workers' Alliance of America, actually became the recognized official bargaining agent for WPA workers, enmeshing its leaders in bargaining with the government over program operations and financing. Underpinning this change was the focus on the Communist Party's decision to pursue an alliance with the Roosevelt administration as part of its anti-fascist Popular Front policy. This led the party to organize support for Roosevelt's 1936 election and his New Deal policies, and to de-emphasize oppositional and militant mass actions in favor of more established political activities, such as petition drives and lobbying. In 1938, the Workers' Alliance of America locals, which is the National Organization of the Unemployed, even campaigned for pro-New Deal candidates. The labor movement, riding the growth in the economy, soon replaced the unemployment movement as the most powerful social force for change. However, the Communist Party, in line with its new orientation, stopped promoting and in many cases actually opposed rank and file direct actions such as sit-down strikes. It gave its full support to CIO leaders who, for their own reasons, saw support for Roosevelt as the most promising way to strengthen the labor movement. For example, CIO leaders established Labor's Nonpartisan League in 1936 to support President Roosevelt's re-election and his New Deal program. The movement might have overcome this drift towards reformism, but future events were not helpful. The combination of World War II, the vicious post-war anti-communist attacks on all critics of capitalism, especially in the labor movement, and the strength of the post-war economic expansion finally buried the promise of further radical transformation. There would be no third New Deal. So what are the final lessons? The first, well, I think there's obviously a lot of lessons from this experience for those advocating a Green New Deal. First, repeating, is that existence or even recognition of a crisis can't be counted on to motivate a change in government policy if that change threatens the status quo. A broad-based movement for change that threatens the stability of the system can, however, we could see, force a significant change in government policy. So it's important for activists to let participants know change can happen, but it requires movement building, it requires activism. The initial drive for change was the movement of unemployed, and its early power came from the CP's ability to establish a network of local unemployed councils that provided unemployed workers with the opportunity to better understand the cause of their hard times, build class solidarity through collective actions in defense of local needs, and become part of broader campaigns for public policies on the national level that were responsive to the local concerns. It is likely that activists for a Green New Deal will have to engage in a similar process of movement building if they hope to force a meaningful change in government policy. Despite the fact that we face a number of interrelated social, economic, and ecological crises, activists must still find ways to weave together different local organizations into a nationwide political force able to project a vision of responsive system change, as well as define and fight for associated policies. Another lesson: the government response to political pressure can be expected to fall far short of movement demands for transformative change. Thus, movement activists have to prepare participants for a long and ongoing campaign of mobilization, organizational development, and pressure. Fourth and finally, movements have to be careful not to become too policy-oriented. The New Deal included a number of different programs, each designed to address different problems. This created a natural tendency for the different movements that comprise the broader social movement to narrow their focus and concentrate on finding ways to respond to the policy shortcomings that most concern their members. Thus, while the employed, those in relief, and those fighting for unionization initially shared a sense of common struggle, over time, in large measure because of their success in winning reforms, that shared commitment to the broader social movement for societal change weakened. This is a challenge that the movement for a Green New Deal can also expect to face if it's successful enough to force meaningful government reforms, especially given the multiplicity of the challenges the country faces. The only way to minimize this challenge is to ensure that movement organizing from the very beginning encourages participants to see the need for the broader transformative change inspired by the notion of a Green New Deal, and to draw from their struggle an ever more concrete understanding of how that change can be advanced and how real improvement in their lives depends on its achievement. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very insightful and interesting presentation. So today we've got lots of knowledge about the internal logics and dynamics of militant protest during the New Deal, and what kind of the pressures did this kind of protest movement to the kind of New Deal formation forward during the 1930s. So as we have got lots of knowledge, so I anticipate lots of very interesting discussion among us. So who will start the question? So could you write down your question in chatting room, or raise your hand and turn on your microphone and give your questions? We'll start. So yeah, David. Yeah, turn on your microphone. Yeah, okay.
Well, it's a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Marty. And I just want to mention that Marty wrote an article for the journal that I edit, Science and Society, many years ago. I forget when that was, 1980s probably, which I think is an underrated article. It's about something that he didn't discuss tonight. It was about the Office of Price Administration. But it made essentially the same point, because what he showed in incredible detail is that the work during the Second World War on control of prices and interest rates was not something that was bureaucratically devised in Washington and carried out on an administrative basis, but it involved hundreds of thousands of local volunteers. And that kind of underlying motivation is, I'm just making his point. I'll ask a question in a minute, which I think actually really distinguished between the Bolsheviks and the other left factions in 1917 in Russia. And there are many other parallels that that could be drawn. I think it's an extremely important point. The only thing I would wonder about, and I don't have a strong position on this, I don't have any reason to say it must be one way or it must be another way. But the capacity of the Communist Party by 1935-36 to actually talk to the Roosevelt administration, to actually talk to the president, and to talk to politicians, and to on all levels, had a great deal to do with its central role in the organizing drives that were the basis of the power which that represented. And I think that if we were to draw the conclusion that in supporting the New Deal and in even making some tactical compromises as part of that support, the Communist Party was betraying the militancy which it had revealed in the earlier period. It may be true, but it needs to be analyzed very concretely, because I think if you're talking about the things that people in the Green New Deal movement in the United States today and similar movements in other countries are going to face in the future, and trying to draw lessons from the experience of the 1930s, I think we have to realize that they too will be confronted with some of these very hard tactical choices. That is, when we speak in abstract ways about we need unity and we need coalition building, and I think these are correct positions to take, but that unity and coalition building do involve the left in some very serious choices. And if left leadership goes to the left rank and file and says, look, just as in a trade union struggle, when trade union leadership sometimes has to go to the rank and file and say, the situation is this, that if we force these demands, the company could shut down, and workers are faced with hard choices, and a responsible revolutionary leadership has got to recognize that those choices are very real for the working people on the ground. And that's
some problem.
are going to be necessary. That was my point.
Yeah.
Should I respond, or do you want to take more questions?
Yeah, one by one.
Okay. First, thank you for that mention of that article. To say one more thing about that period, what was so striking to me is that during World War II, one of the great achievements was, despite reducing all the production for civilian goods and having everyone employed, there was hardly any inflation over the last several years. And when government tried to put all these complex laws and rules on there, business didn't follow them, and there'd be inflation and workers would strike. What worked was the government created a very simple price list, and all volunteer boards across the United States were deputized to go into markets and stores and confront businesses, and if they violated the laws, to bring them in front of volunteer neighborhood councils who could actually have power to remove their license. And this was one of the things that business hated the most. And whenever they'd weaken it, prices would go up, and so the government put it down. It's just an example of what, and I appreciate David pointing it out, is that there are lots of capacities that we have to organize and run things, and that we need more of a sense of confidence in ourselves to think about how to do those things. I take David's point seriously. I mean, these processes are not simple. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to take organizing seriously. And where I see for a lot of the Green New Deal kind of interest, it's imagining the policy, or, just sort of imagining these things happening. Well, we're going to do this or do that. And well, how does it happen? How do you build the strength? And even how does it, I've been actually studying World War II planning. How did the government actually suppress certain industries and promote other industries? And, start production here, things that we'll all have to do if we're going to be converting the economy. My position is still open. I think that the party leadership, I would never say they sold workers out. I think they made a broader strategic sense of the global conditions that required alliances. And those alliances they felt would be threatened by a continuation of some of that militancy. It's hard to know if they were right. It's hard to know what would have happened if there was dangers of fascism. In 36, 37, 38, the elites in the United States corporations were organizing against Roosevelt, and there were all sorts of dangers. So it's hard to know what might have happened had they gotten through that period. But the way I think that they managed that was quite top down, and I think it led to a lot of frustrations and a lot of demobilization. Again, you're not there, who knows how things are said, but from some of the histories I've read, some of the analysis, it seems to me that mistakes were made. I'm not saying that they were dishonest, but they were made in choices. And the consequence was demobilization. That, when you have an unemployed movement, and pretty soon it's inviting the head of the Labor Department of the New Deal to speak at the yearly conference, and it's it's hard to turn that on and off. So I think that, the problem, who knows, even under the best of conditions, what would have happened. It's clear that pressure was changing government policy. And it's clear that there were decisions made by some of the people who were to be most credited for creating those pressures to tack a different direction. And it's clear that those movements suffered as a result. Whether they could have come back around, whether they could have managed that period if it wasn't for the war and it wasn't for the communist attacks on the Communist Party and communism and the expansion, it's hard to say. There was certainly a revival of activism in 46. What might have happened, I don't know. But I agree with you. These are hard issues about how one deals with reforms, especially. And I think that was one of the things that interested me. And I think that people organizing a Green New Deal don't think much about. If they put out a reform, how does it happen? Does it just happen because we elect someone? Does it happen because we push them? How do we work with that reform? How do we prepare people to know that there'll be likely reforms? Every one of these reforms fell short of what people were asking for. How do you keep that vision current? How do you keep people work? And I think that requires organization. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges in the United States, which is that there are all these kind of efforts around demands and not nearly as much success in building some kind of stable organization, some stable relationships that can connect people across the country.
Yeah, thank you. So as president, I have some questions. So as we already got lots of knowledge about on the one side of the token, that means the kind of militant resistance, militant protest from the workers. And I'm curious about the other side of the token, that means the kind of dynamics of ruling groups. So as you know, your presentation reminds me of the kind of Korean history of these 3 decades. We have lots of very strong base of the militant unionism, but the kind of consequences of institutional changes are very different and very weak. So I'm curious about the links between militant protest and the specific institutional changes. So let me give 2 questions. So this New Deal situation is very specific with a certain very particular conjuncture, economic conjuncture of booming up. And so what kind of some consequences can we anticipate between 2 different economic conjunctures with similar kind of labor militantism? That's one question. So second one is the kind of internal conflicts between ruling parties. So how did Roosevelt use this kind of protest and divide their own ruling groups and push it forward certain kind of institutional changes. And what did it mean? What did it mean to the kind of some popular movement, because they became some kind of co-opted with this kind of usage of militant protest and so on. So one question is about a certain specific economic conjuncture. Another is the kind of a specific arrangement of internal conflicts of these kind of ruling groups.
Wow. Big questions. Before I forget, I'll give you an example of some of the things that I see going on in the United States that seem promising. And maybe this is one way to sort of answer the first question. In California, there's been a very interesting, and in Los Angeles, to be more specific, interesting and I think somewhat successful, although it's running into its own limits, of something called the Bus Riders Union. And what they did, this group called the Strategy Center, is they in Los Angeles, if you've ever visited, it's a city based on the car, and buses are very few between. They don't run well, and really the only people who ride buses are really the poor workers, mostly people of color who don't have cars. And what this Strategy Center did is they went and they got people who spoke Korean and Spanish and English. I think those were the three languages. And they would get on the buses, and people are just crammed in there, and they'd say, we need more buses. And then one of their people would go to the bus driver and say, don't you want better buses and more buses so you don't have to jam people in your bus, because the buses are jammed and they're driving by people waiting. And so they would start talking about it. And they would then say to people, come to this meeting. You deserve better buses. You deserve environmentally, clean buses. You deserve more buses on the routes, so on and so forth. And then they would go to the Korean community and different communities and churches and say, we're trying to do this. And so they built this very powerful group of riders, mostly workers of color, with the support of their communities, who made alliances with the bus drivers, and they sued the city of Los Angeles, and they won. And the courts actually made the Bus Riders Union the overseer of spending on transportation budgets, which allowed them to go from high-speed rail that would only affect the wealthy to actually putting more buses on the city streets around schedules. And so, and in the process of doing this, they overcame a lot of issues of tensions between African Americans and Koreans and Latinx people. And so what they're trying to do is to build on that, to say public sector is important. How do we build around programs that are class centered, like buses, and are focused on the environment and are focused on forcing a change in government policy? So that seems to me a really, important and strategic way to start taking advantage of the moment, building organizations with a clear class perspective around environment, focused on the public sector. There's in my city, Portland, remains to be seen how promising. The voters voted to tax corporations in the county, and they're going to be generating about $40 or $50 million, which goes to a council of 6 people who were appointed with certain criteria, who will give money to groups that are responsive to the environmental and work needs of communities of color and poor communities. So this money will be used for solar, for retrofitting buildings, for training workers in those communities to do this kind of work. So again, it's using taxes, it's progressive, that it's on wealthy people, and it's focusing on the community having responsibility for getting its resources and directing them to communities of color in need. So I think those are kinds of policies that shift power, that aren't just making demands and saying hoping, but actually are shifting power and shifting people's thinking about how working people can actually put themselves in these positions. And then it's a matter of also learning, how do we, let me just say this. I had a number of people who were kind of my mentors, who were older than me, and people like Eddie Borstein, who worked in Cuba under Che Guevara, and he worked in Chile under Allende, and Harry Magdoff and Paul Sweezy, people I know. They all had experience running economies, whether it was working in World War II or in socialist countries. People like me, we didn't want to work for government. We didn't want to work for corporations. So we're strong on theory, but we need to start getting experience like this fund, this Portland Clean Energy Fund. And how do we actually organize these things? How do we do this to demonstrate competency? So I think that's a really important way to sort of take advantage of the moment and think about ways to combine the environment, to highlight class, to find ways of overcoming divisions. I don't know if that answers a little bit of the first question, but these are the kinds of ways I think about some of these things. Other things like, for example, the teachers union in the United States, in most cities, is always under pressure because funding comes from local government property taxes. And there's a big push to keep property taxes down. And so, schools' budgets are always tight. And teachers are always looking for community support. So I've been trying to organize meetings where school teachers, the radical ones, there's certain cohorts, would meet with environmentalists, would meet with women's groups, would meet with anti-war groups, and talk about curriculum. What do we want the schools to be teaching? How do we do that? And if you can develop curriculum, and we as a community can begin to push for communities, for the school board to elect school board people and people who will do that, we begin to create a kind of a synergy there where different groups are operating together, again, around the environment, through a labor union, the teachers union. So to me, there are things like that which begin to create organization and relationships. Now, none of those are necessarily revolutionary. And I do think that that's where people like us who have a vision have to be playing roles to kind of keep getting people not to say, okay, we won the buses, now everything is good. Or, yeah, we got some money coming in here and now, this will be good. Or this is an interesting lesson plan. But how do we tie it to all the organizing that's going on? How do we take different visions? When I go back to look at literature in the 1960s in the United States, there are people talking about workplace democracy, and there are people, taking, and now it's like, can we get a wage increase? Will our business allow us to be socially distant? Our demands have fallen so low. And so how do we kind of pick them up? As for Roosevelt, the question about the state, which is a really interesting one that I haven't studied nearly enough. I know as a particular that Roosevelt, when he was going to run for re-election, the business elites, I think, were kind of divided about the early New Deal, because initially Roosevelt's approach was not that far from Hoover's. But by 1935, they didn't like the direction it was going in. And so they made it very clear in 1935, they were not supporting Roosevelt for re-election. And in that sense, I think Roosevelt said, well, what do I do for my own survival? And that led him to turn to the left and the progressive movement and say, okay, I'm here supporting you. And so he designed and accepted, not the most radical policies, but I think that for him, it was a recognition that there were these divisions and that big corporations were not going to support him. And so there's kind of that semi-autonomy of the state where he said, I'm leaning this way. And, in hindsight, it was very successful. He was able to ride this wave to kind of take control, defeat the party's social insurance system, put his own, defeat the radicalism, create a national labor relations. But it took a while for all those things to really solidify. And so I think he held on through support from labor. And also, I think, this is where reforms come through, and David's discussion of strategy. The capitalists were pushing in 37, 38, something far more draconian and terrible. And so, if you can keep Roosevelt in office, you have more freedom to maybe do certain things. So I think it's recognition that there are these divisions within the state, but who knows, if it hadn't been Roosevelt, who was very astute, it could have been someone who totally botched it and did something else that enabled radicalism to keep growing. But I think we really need to keep in mind the kind of thing you're saying about, theories of the state. When we make demands, how do we envision states responding to them? And what power do we have to kind of play off elites to create space for us? In a period of intense crisis, we have more leverage. In periods when there's not an intense crisis, probably a lot less leverage.
Yeah, so first we have a question from Seung-Jin, and then give a chance to Ik. So Seung-Jin gave a similar related kind of questions, very critical questions about the kind of socialism from above. So he wrote his questions in chatting room. So let me read briefly. I skip the first part of acknowledgement. He is concerned that overemphasizing the role of organization, Communist Party, and movement building may unintendedly lead to the socialism from above, from which he thinks most of the variety of the 21st century socialism have distanced since the rise of the alter globalization movement since the Seattle in 1999. What do you think about that?
Well, from what I can tell is that the party really turned the unemployed councils pretty independent. That initially, as I said, they viewed it as their instrument. They wanted the meetings to be talking about foreign policy, and recruiting was difficult, and they pulled back. And in fact, in many cases, they didn't want the unemployed councils to be working with the unemployed leagues or some of these other things, but activists did. And I think one of the reasons that they were so strong is that although the party may have, who knows what party leadership felt, they may wanted to control it, they allowed those unemployed councils to operate quite independently. And the networks, there was great transmission of successes. We did this here, there was not a central body that said, here's the line, here's how you approach this. There were huge debates. For example, the unemployed leagues had a position of stealing food. The unemployed councils debated that. And they said, no, we're not for stealing food. That's not a good way. We want these demands on the system. So I think that the strength of the unemployed councils were really that the party, if it wasn't for the party, they wouldn't have been created. The party was there quickly, envisioned a crisis, set up a mechanism. But they were also, wise enough, and I think, as much top-down control as you may have wanted, a lot of the rank and file party very skilled and very disciplined organizers, and they gave their lives to these things. And I think they had a lot of freedom. And so the councils of unemployed councils are not reducible to some top-down organization. And I think the way in which they also organized, some of their national hunger marches and things like that were one thing, but the people who were elected locally, and they came from the councils or the community. And when they came back, it's not like today where they flew. They did car caravans, and they stopped in cities, and they met and talked with people. So I think it was really a very grassroots oriented, but I think without the party, and let's put it this way, the educational apparatus of the party that created this bigger vision, that encouraged people to see the crisis as a crisis of capitalism. That doesn't happen automatically. So I think that the fact, that there was a political instrument that had a vision of transformation was very important, but the activities were not so controlled. And it's certainly true in some of the early organizing in Toledo, or even San Francisco, the Longshore, or Minneapolis. Minneapolis is interesting because the Teamsters, the Trotskyists, sent some of their people into the local, but the local was very democratic and argued and fought and created a vision that was grabbed by people. So I think there certainly is always the danger of one organization coming in and say, here's my vision, here's the groups. But I think in the 30s, that wasn't a major problem. I think where it may have been a problem towards the end, as I was saying, where sometimes the party would say to some of its leaders, I've read situations like this where the party was then pressing some of its trade union activists to say, don't support the sit-down strike, 37, 38. They took positions against some of these things. And there they put pressure on people. Some of the people said, okay, some quit the party and continued to work. It's difficult, but I do think some kind of political instrument is necessary to see a unity, to develop and help these different groups that are involved in organizing have an overall sense of what system transformation means, how it all comes together. The warning is a good warning, but in this case, I think it's not an accurate assessment of the way the movement process happened.
Yeah, and then Ik.
Oh. Well, greetings first of all. I was invited to this meeting by Paul Zaremka, whom I met during my Fulbright years at SUNY Buffalo, 1977-78. I was doing a master's degree with Leslie Fiedler then on Alex Haley's roots, on the Afro-American history and in Black American literature, and I was teaching at Tolstoy College. Marty might be familiar with some of it. Tolstoy College was an interdisciplinary college of SUNY with members of the civil rights movement of the NAACP, with members of the Black Panthers, with the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, with Party Weatherman. Patty Hearst was studying with Herbert Marcuse then, or shortly before I got there. And I'm from Austria, no? So thanks for this was an excellent briefing on the Great Depression. I just remembered that when I studied Labor's Untold Story by the Union of Needleworkers, they had a chapter heading with a quote from Bertolt Brecht talking about the strike in Chicago in the slaughterhouses, where the demonstrators at the barricades were calling "Praise the Lord" and "Pass the ammunition." Yeah, so being from Austria with a civil war against the Austro-fascists in 1934, I know what I'm talking about too. And I just wanted to bring in. You said it's important to coordinate the strikes globally, especially the Green New Deal. By now is an agenda that is, heavy on top of the European Union. Mm-hmm. Biden has jumped on the bandwagon. And so far, we don't hear a lot apart from verbal declarations from China, not to speak of Russia. Yeah? And Africa is left over. If you want to talk about imperialism and about the Four Chiefs, Jason Moore, if you're familiar with him, you're talking about land grabbing and about a systematic, massive incursion against human rights, against everything on behalf of the corporate powers, in this case, the state-owned enterprises of China. And the same is true, more or less globally. The problem today is that the Great Depression was more or less, first of all, a phenomenon in the US. We need to take into account that at the same time that the US was anxiously watching Stalin's 5-year plan and the phenomenal rates of growth there, they also watched, and corporate America was very sympathetic to the rise of fascism in Austria. Yeah. And today, with globalization going apace, and we are, I mean, sort of trying to, economists, wherever you look at them, are wringing their hands for growth. Now, with $135 trillion annual GDP, and from 2017, the addition, the 7 trillion addition to GDP worldwide was equal to the world GDP of 1940. Well, where do you want to grow to? I have an old saying of the Cree Indians. It's only when the last tree has been felled and the last river has been poisoned, greetings to China, that you will find out that you cannot eat money. And we have put in like $30 trillion of liquidity into the system, working up derivatives bubbles and speculative bubbles all over the world. And you were talking about the Minsky moment in 1929. So that is ante partes. The system is basically working itself into a final crisis. And economists of good standing, mainstream economists, are nothing less than a precarious sect of a theological sectarian group. When you look at, mainstream economics, the way it is based upon growth and exploitation and speculative instincts, yeah, animal instincts, you know where we're going. And people in Europe are, on one hand, more afraid to lose their fetters than heading on to confronting the system at large and demanding radical and systemic change. And social ecological transition is systemic change. And it cannot be based on growth rates of 3.5 worldwide. It's just, out of the question.
I can't speak for, thank you for that. I can't speak for many places, but in the United States, I think one of the biggest problems is that people have, for lots of reasons that I'm sure you could imagine, have lost, have no sense of public sector or government as an effective force. They don't believe in it. And they don't have confidence in it. And when you have people who have occupied positions of government who don't like government as well, who are trying to kill it, we understand why. And so one of the challenges, I think, is kind of a two-stage level challenge, is to be demanding the big changes that we know we need for the reasons you say, but finding the ways to engage locally, like bus riders, unions, or other things, where we build up capacities and we build up confidence while continuing to make those big demands. It's going to be needing to regulate, demonstrate that the need to, for public regulation of all these industries and shrinking them at the same time, supporting new ones. But that kind of planning, that kind of control, it is going to win support, is going to require rebuilding people having a sense of that government is something that's going to be responsive to them. And right now we don't have that. And so I tend to be kind of a national thinker, but more and more I feel like these struggles in the cities and locales, to not because those projects solve the problem, but they provide ways for people to begin to develop relationships, to begin to develop organization, begin to develop some confidence, and they have to be connected to the national, maybe much like the unemployed councils fighting in the cities with the national movements, hunger movements and everything, demanding new more radical policies. But I mean, I agree. We're headed. We're already facing and experiencing the consequences of this insanity. And so the question is how we break into it. And my concern in the United States is that there seems to be so much attention to policy, national policy, because of, I'm kind of returning to, my own motivation for the paper was because they, well, Roosevelt came in and he did that. And as if we get the right person in, they logically see what you and I see. This is insanity, and they're going to do the right things. And so the point of doing this is they know it doesn't happen that way. There's structural reasons, there are all sorts of things that it's pressure. But what's important to say is, back to the theory of the state, it's not impossible to shift a state under the right conditions. So we don't want to start by saying, oh, we can't do anything until we have socialism, until we have this, the changes. Well, we can. Under the right terms and the right conditions, movements can win and build on those victories rather than the other way. And so we have to, as David's saying, we have to study those. Where do those tensions come from? Where are the compromises? And how do we build those movements? And I just don't see enough.
You're quoting Barack Obama's final words in his final farewell speech. Yes, we can.
I wouldn't put them in the same context, but yes. And so I think we just need a lot more serious conversations about organizing itself, along with the very important work that's being done on what does eco-socialism mean? How do we think about organizing economies? Lots of big challenges.
Yeah.
Can I just, throw in two practical examples? Yeah. In 2002, the then German Bundeskanzler Schröder talked about an attack of the locusts. Yeah, that is financial corporates, and called for regulation. Angela Merkel then joined, and there was an immediate outcry of the banking and the financial industry. No, we cannot do that because you're ruining the economy. Full stop. That did it. And the same is true over and over again. A couple of years ago, the German Ministry of Agriculture was faced with a massive opposition against Roundup, insecticides. Yeah, you can buy them in any supermarket. Yeah, and this stuff is deadly.
Oh, of course.
So the minister was supposed to sign into law at the European Parliament a verdict against Roundup, and she had the order of the cabinet in Germany to go against that. But the lobby, the agricultural lobby in Germany, was so strong that she just signed. She didn't sign it, and there was no. Of course, there is massive protest, but Europe being what it is, yeah. You have a strong tradition of local protest. Think of the Gilets jaunes in France. Yeah, think of Greece, for example, during the period of austerity and crisis, when just people ran into the shops, like Dario Fo wrote his famous theater piece. We are not going to pay, so they just went into supermarkets and left. That is a strong anarchist, spontaneous local tradition that a priori does not organize or is not well organized. And it's very difficult to do that. I've been in NGO work for like 30 years now, that I'm a member of the Federal Coordination of the Austrian Social Forum.
Well, I hear you. I mean, one of the reasons why I've been so pleased to be a part of this is because I've always had a lot of respect for the kind of organizing that's gone on in South Korea. And I hope through these things, to maintain. I know that in many ways, when I started going to South Korea in the late 1980s, and was very inspired by the kind of labor movement, which wasn't just a labor movement, it was a social movement. And
these guys are strong.
and this, this speaks to the kinds of questions, that I run into. I work a lot with the labor movement in the United States. And so the question is, what kind of staff do you hire? Do you hire, people who are good at negotiating a contract? Do you hire people who are good at building alliances and organizing? And so for me, it was watching the early militancy of the Korean labor movement, and even the early years of the Korean teachers movement, where teachers committed, teachers union was illegal, and they committed to defend, labor education, defending human rights, and one community support. And then over time, of course, I think very thoughtful, strategic movements by the state through the suppression of, of communism and playing on all that, led to the labor movement becoming more of a labor movement and making decisions to save the Korean trade union movement, KCTU, to survive. And as a consequence, I think what we see is that militancy alone is not enough. We need this other vision. We need a political vision that can provide a different context for organizing. And I think that, I mean, it was very difficult decisions, I'm sure, but having watched the Korean labor movement decide to figure out it can survive, although that was a battle as well, it jettisoned its connection to the broader social movements, and it left them divided. And I think that in Korea, that's been one of the big challenges, is how to rebuild that kind of integration. And so for me,
you're right, the Social Democrats and Spartacus in Germany. Huh? Who betrayed us Social Democrats?
I just think they're hard choices, and there's a lot to be learned from studying how those choices evolved and where there were opportunities and how to build from them. One of the things that in the United States that we don't do is, when we have struggles, then they pass. And we don't keep those struggles alive to look back and say, what worked? How did people respond to us? What did the media do? How did the government? So that when the next struggle comes along, we're often caught unprepared. People haven't been inoculated with lies and distortions. And so for me, it was always interesting coming to Korea and trying to see what the labor education was like. How are unions working with workers? How are they keeping that history alive and transmitting it from one generation to another? And not very well, unfortunately. It's challenging.
Really, it's time to wrap up, but there is a final question. So, but against the anticipation, I think that this Korean social movements are really collapsing. That could be one important issue to be discussed further next time. So let us have the final question from Marcel, and then reply from Martin. Yeah, please turn on your microphone.
Sorry, I didn't realize it was up to me. Thank you very much. I thought it was an extremely interesting talk, and also the discussion was, I thought, one of the best for me from my interest. So partly what it reminded me of, especially in the first part of your presentation, was things I was involved in the late 80s. I was in the unemployed movement in Germany, in Hamburg, and we did exactly the same things. And as the discussion turned to the question of more robust national organizing, this movement more or less fizzled out around 1989, which is, and I never understood what the connection actually there was, because amongst the people I was involved with, nobody was interested particularly or took orders from any other place but the local context. But obviously there must have been some connection. So this all fizzled out around 1990 or so, but it would have never occurred even to think to any of us that a stronger national organizing could have changed that. So I would have thought, but the strength of the movement as it existed in the 80s was that certainly in Hamburg, where what I can speak about, was that it was in equal parts based on what we used to call autonomists, basically indirectly resulting from the late 60s and 70s students movements and others, the churches, and the so-called Communist Party, which was obviously well, the official Communist Party in West Germany at that time. So, and these three factions were equally strong and were on quite cordial terms on the issues that were at stake, specifically in the unemployed movement, when they would have not been on talking terms on pretty much anything else. And obviously everybody knew that. So you wouldn't, you didn't have terribly much in common with the other two factions likewise. Although the churches and the communists actually were quite close. So they were almost the same faction or two parts of the same faction, but they were equally strong. And any form of more formal organizing would certainly have strengthened the so-called Communist Party and church factions, which would have led to the demobilization or the splitting off of everybody else who was not on their tickets in ideological terms regarding everything else. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, the successful period of this kind of more local organizing presupposes the exclusion of the big picture, right? So it works as long as you don't talk too much about what the big vision is, because the big people differ on what the big vision is or should be. So I'm kind of skeptical. I think that the failure of these movements is simply due to the larger historical forces that operated. And in a sense, we're inevitable. So you should probably simply accept that things last for a while and then they disappear. And then maybe something else pops up, but you cannot save. It's not like you can bank the energy of a movement in a particular structure and make it survive when the larger historical context simply suggests that it wouldn't.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I think it's really interesting and a really important point. A couple thoughts, and then I know we need to stop. One is, you're absolutely right that there's a lot of historical specificity in what was possible then, and you may be right that it reached its limits for the same historical reasons, and clearly having a strong party meant that these, and that was just one of the party. There was Socialist Party and Musty's party operated, at least the Communist Party, nationally to do. We don't have those things, and there are lots of reasons why we're not establishing a new party that's going to do all these things. So it's however we create linkages and do these things is going to have to emerge in a different way. So you're absolutely right. We can't look back and say, this was a recipe for success. Let's bake it the same way, and because it's not going to happen. But I think that there are these intermediate. Maybe I'm stretching too much because I'm got so immersed in the period. But I look at, for example, in the United States, houselessness is a huge problem. Every major city has tent cities that are up and down streets. I mean, huge complexes of people, and sort of the liberal and, I understand it, people give to food banks. But what if people began organizing instead of the Unemployed Councils, which people got cards and they were part of those. We had the Houseless Councils, where people would say, you're not houseless because you're terrible. You're houseless because we've got this, decaying system which can't support you and doesn't take care of you. And so what would that movement begin to demand on a national level? How would they begin to say, cut the military and put money into, public housing that's green and environmentally friendly and around mass transit? That begins a process much like the Unemployed Councils did of saying, we want social insurance. We want, which isn't necessarily the revolution, but it starts to say, here's what we expect from our system. And there's no reason why we couldn't begin to see the houseless organize around their own self-interest in ways that would be easy to connect to building trades and environmentalists and all sorts of other people. And so that's where I can see national movements maybe starting to take roots, not because there's a overarching party that's establishing all these things, but because we have these phenomenon and they're common, and they would begin to create a national echo rather than just being demanding on local people to be able to sleep in a park. So I think there are ways in which we can sort of think about those kinds of things without thinking that we can really recreate something from an earlier period.
Yeah, sorry that it's really time to finish our discussion. So, so next time.
Can I have 1 minute? Just 1 minute?
Next
Just
time,
I
please.
don't
We have already 2 hours of discussion.
Yeah, I don't expect Mari's answer. Just
yeah, so
just
30 minutes.
yeah, 30 seconds, not 30 minutes.
30 seconds. So.
Yeah. Mari, thank you so much. And I'm really very pleased to listen to your presentation today. I've been public sector SEIU Service Employees International Union. Over 7 years, I was local district offices union steward. I want to talk to you just one single sentence. Please think about the generation gap. When I started my position, I was 62. Now I am 73. Now, I suggest.
We're the same age.
Oh, really? Anyway, thank you so much. I suggested local union, SEIU 721, 2 things many years ago. Union and Community United Committee. The second issue I suggested is we union need to participate of the management of Los Angeles County government, human resources, and all spreading out district local management. And then union refused my suggestions. What I'm talking to you is the late 1920s and 1930s, still then period of time is close to European immigrants' day. That's what I'm talking about, generation. The generation, they were still remembering, even though just even sympathetically, the ideology of at least social democracy in Europe, and then possibly communism. But since then, until now, you know that US labor union corruption, So I don't expect your answer. Just to think about my suggestion, very conservative issue, because I'm talking about generation. Okay, today we are here at the round table, I'm not sure myself, but all of my honoring participants are Marxist ideology all over you today. So I'm gonna stop here. And also I appreciate all the time Baek Seung-Wook's participation, but I personally, or maybe more than that, I do not agree he expressed collapsing in social movement of the South Korea. I wanna state this.
Yeah.
Maybe
I didn't say collapse.
maybe
That's a collapse.
maybe stagnating.
Yeah.
We need patience.
Yeah. Okay.
Social revolution, the idea of a social movement never collapsed because we are always exploited. So let's be patient, and then someday, near or longer, it will become back. Even US, we are gonna go occupy movement again. We will win. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Instead of Martin, Chung-Ang is finalize the remarks of this discussion. So anyway, there are lots of issues to be discussed further, but I'm sorry to say to finish this session. So please finalize your some presentation with short, brief remarks, Martin.
Well, it's hard to sum up except to say this was very stimulating. I really appreciated the opportunity to share my thoughts and to talk about these issues. There are no simple answers, but to be with comrades who are trying to think through what to do is the best thing, and it energizes me. So I thank you very much for staying with this long talk and for sharing so many of your thoughts and experiences.
Thank you
so
very much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it can. And so see you next time. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot.
Thank you.